So thank you so much for joining us in the coronavirus reading group today. You've shared a really delightful segment from your book, At the Limits of Cure. And I think we have a lot to talk about, both, in a historical context, but feeding forward to the dynamics of today. So you're bringing us to this moment in colonial medicine and the history of South Asia, when people are reckoning with these both different ideas about disease causation, but also ideas about bringing bodies back into a state that is more or less normal. And there's obviously a lot of attempts to bring a sort of cure to the coronavirus, a prophylactic vaccine. And maybe if we could just open it up with you reflecting on the current moment and what this historical perspective might give us on the dynamics of today.
Sure. Well, let me just first of all say thank you to you and to Rachel for organizing this and for inviting me to join you today. So the book is about tuberculosis and the idea of cure, how cures are constituted, how they fail, how they unravel, how they come apart. And it really stretches back into the 19th century, thinking about everything from sanatoriums and gold therapy, travel cures to sanatoriums and antibiotics. And I think, one of the things I struggled with in writing this book is thinking about to what extent is tuberculosis a kind of model organism or a paradigm for other kinds of conditions, right? And to what extent is it quite singular? And I think there is a tendency to think of tuberculosis in some ways as a kind of model or as a kind of paradigm for what has come in its wake. And I think this is true in very specific ways, right? So thinking about, for example, the establishment of specific procedures for determining what constitutes cure. So the randomized controlled trial, I think most centrally, was a kind of critical mode for determining efficacy, and one that we still see kind of very much in play around the COVID vaccines, around potential cures and therapies, and thinking about what constitutes proper evidence. So how do we know whether a cure is in fact curative, which I think depends on not only authority, but also on procedure critically, right? So the kinds of procedure that one undertakes in order to demonstrate. And then of course, the spectacle, which has never really gone away, right? So how do you publicize? How do you make clear that you have done this procedure properly and therefore can show to others who aren't necessarily there to witness directly that a cure is in fact a cure? And I think we see all of this happening around every vaccine, around every treatment, with the kind of determination that various vaccines are efficacious or don't have certain kinds of side effects, or the kind of desire to put these out as quickly as possible. It means that full procedure has not been completed, right? And with tuberculosis and with antibiotics, there was also this strong sense that even after the end of a trial, you don't really know whether it's curative for years, right? You have the sense that someone might be better after the end of the treatment course, but will it come back, right? Will the cure unravel after 6 months, after a year, after 5 years, after 10? Now with these vaccines, we don't have that kind of a window. We've had to move quite quickly. So what you've seen is these vaccines erupt into the public. And I think that's produced a certain set of concerns around publicity. So how do you demonstrate that in this case, a vaccine is efficacious when you don't have the luxury of hindsight, when you can say, well, we've shown that people who've taken this vaccine over the last 2 years, 3 years, we can show that it's safe, right? And this is, I think, part of what's at the heart of concerns about, whether or not these vaccines are efficacious and whether they're safe. And similarly with cures. And I think what all this has led to is a kind of shift, I think, again, in what the standards are, right? And I think there's a shift towards authority. So it's less, I think, about procedure and more about who is telling us that a vaccine is efficacious or a cure is efficacious. Is it Trump? Is it certain scientists? Is it Modi in India? Is it organized around a certain kind of nationalism, or this idea that India has its own vaccine, Brazil has its own vaccine, which for a lot of folks who are, I don't want to say anti-nationalist, but not invested in nationalism as a project, this is not a good enough reason, right, to take an Indian vaccine or a Brazilian vaccine because it is homemade, right? At the same time, to undermine these vaccines is also to kind of say, well, you don't believe in our nation, right? You don't believe in the power of Indian science or Brazilian science, and so on and so forth. So I think we're caught in a moment when a lot of the standard narratives and tropes of both the anthropology of medicine and anthropology of science, but also history of science, have to be pushed a bit further, right? We can't just rely on, a kind of critique of the nation state or a critique of scientific authority or procedure, but think about how these things work out in very particular ways. And this is kind of something that's quite important for me in the book, is that I try to veer away from generality. So, when I was first invited to participate, I was a bit concerned because I thought to myself, what do I know about COVID? Any more than everybody else, but it's not something I've spent years or decades really studying, although this last year has felt like decades. Nevertheless, I think there are ways in which these histories can inform our present, but I think it have to be done so carefully. There's so much at stake. And so I think we need to think very carefully about what aspects of these pasts might inform the present or already do, and which ones perhaps won't, or perhaps would cause us to overgeneralize, to kind of assume that we already have these master narratives of what science looks like and how it unfolds. We already know why people are vaccine hesitant, right? We already have all the stories in our heads. We can go to Tuskegee. We already know that that's the place to go. So I think what this moment calls for me is, in some ways, a kind of epistemological modesty, a kind of veering back and saying, let me see how things unfold, which is very uncomfortable because in this moment, we're so invested in trying to respond quickly, which I think is both the urgency of the pandemic, but also the urgency of social media and the urgency of kind of publishing. And so I'm quite committed to being slow. It's also quite natural to me to be slow. So I think that that kind of suits my own tendencies.
So maybe on that point, I think a really interesting part of the book is related to imagination. And you tell us about this history of science fiction with Kipling imagining a future where the sick are hoisted into the air, not to the hilltops where the microbes are fewer, but into the sterilized air with airships. And a complete inability to understand that we're coming in the decades. And I wonder, just on that subject of vaccine hesitancy, I wonder if there's also kind of a paranoid imaginary at play, and maybe with some justification. mRNA is a new technology, and those that I've had conversations with, like in coffee shops and such, who are have access to vaccines but choose not to get them, there's a there that they're imagining. So I'm wondering if we might return to this earlier moment of a failed SF imaginary to think about the current moment and what we are imagining and incapable of imagining.
Yeah, this is a great question. I think part of my turn towards the imagination was to try to move beyond a narrow conception of knowledge, right? One that extends beyond the clinic or the laboratory, to take seriously forms of knowledge that are produced, say, through the filmic imagination. And film is so important to South Asia as it is everywhere else, but the ways in which science and medicine get taken up and distributed and disseminated via film, right? So what does a cure look like in 1950s Tamil cinema, for example, and what's going on simultaneously in the lab, and how do these things conjoin or not? And I think, I just wanted to ask you, is that sound too loud? Should I close the window? Can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay. So I think—
All good. Lots of sound taking up the recycling here.
So I was going to say, what I think the concern I would have around something like a paranoid imagination, or framing something as a paranoid imagination, is while paranoia certainly has a kind of heuristic, or I guess hermeneutic value, in that it allows us to be skeptical perhaps, or concerned about what is being presented to us. And I think this is kind of critical to much scholarship that goes under the label of science studies, right? To have a certain kind of discipline paranoia about novelty in medicine, around kind of techno-optimism, which is really central to the latter part of my book. At the same time, I think one of the challenges we face at the moment is to take seriously these imaginations on their own terms, right? So what I would mean by this, to give you a kind of example, in the I think in the 60s and 70s, there was a big push around the BCG vaccine in India and everywhere. And the BCG vaccine is the kind of only real vaccine currently being used to vaccinate against tuberculosis. And there's been numerous studies showing in the last maybe 3 or 4 decades that BCG is largely useless, right? It protects small infants against particularly severe forms of tuberculosis, so things like neurotuberculosis or spinal tuberculosis, for a very, very short period of time. But it doesn't do much for adults or anyone, even smaller children who aren't infants, or against pulmonary tuberculosis. And yet BCG is so central to India's vaccination efforts, and to much of the world still uses BCG quite broadly. And so when BCG was being rolled out specifically in South India, there was a real kind of I'm not sure if the word is paranoia or skepticism or what exactly, but there was a real pushback against specifically treating India and Indians like a laboratory, right? The sense that why are you pushing these vaccines, but we don't even know if they work or not. And when we have alternatives, the alternatives, of course, are things like nature cure, right? Are things like the sun, things like also antibiotics, which are being rolled out then too, right? So there's a sense that these new vaccines are, and the concern there against this idea of using India as a lab is definitely one about what are the kinds of side effects produced by these vaccines, what kinds of effects will they have. And what we've found is that there's kind of no deleterious effect of BCG, but there is kind of no effect more generally, right? There's no positive effect either. And so if you think about it kind of at a higher level, there is a huge investment. So what the investment in BCG means, if no physical harm, it means that there's also no benefit, and that money could be diverted elsewhere to other kinds of public health efforts, right? Other kinds of vaccines, other kinds of treatments, or basic sanitation. And so there's always this trade-off. There's never kind of a simple, well, it didn't hurt you, so it can't hurt. And I think sometimes there's a strategy that we have where we think, well, we know that there's no negative side effect, or so we think, and therefore it's probably fine. And the work of Ivan Illich, I think, is really critical here, where he talks about iatrogenesis, beyond just the clinical, but at the institutional level. This idea that even if you give somebody a placebo or something that's ineffective or non-harmful, you are still in some ways robbing from national coffers and the capacity to invest elsewhere in other kinds of, what I think of as other imaginations of cure, ones that might perhaps be more capacious, ones that might focus on basic things like food, clothing, water, air, environment more broadly. And I think, this was with the advent of, I would say, antibiotics, with vaccines, with kind of general push towards bacteriology and bacteriological ways of thinking, we've in some ways lost the capacity to imagine a broader etiology of illness and a broader kind of idea of what a therapy might entail, right? A kind of more social or political medicine. And instead we have these very narrowly focused, what are called kind of vertical programs, So I can, for example, maybe get HIV or tuberculosis medication, but I can't get things like food, right? Because that's not treatment. That's not a good use of money. And I think this is where we have to think about how these imaginations that we think of as paranoia might actually lead us to imagine other forms of kind of therapeutic promise and potential.
Definitely, others jump in if you like. On the subject of the HIV cure, I've just published a book on that last year related to CRISPR and all the intense biotech investment in that. And I really very much agree with the point you just made about kind of the cure as spectacle, and also the ways that the political economy of these aid organizations. You talk about McKinsey and the Gates Foundation in the intro, structuring possible interventions, whereas some of the activist organizations like ACT UP are bringing attention to who gets AIDS, how and why, and all the ways that housing and other things play into that. Just on the AIDS and HIV case in South Asia, how is that playing out? And how is this policy? You sort of introduced us to it in the beginning of the book, but I'm just curious as to where it's gone since.
Sure. Well, I can give you maybe I should just start off saying a few words about how I came into this project and how it ties to HIV. So I began really interested in HIV work being done in India. At that point, India, I think, had the highest number of people with HIV, if not the highest percentage. And Gates Foundation had set up their own kind of project in India called Avahan. And their goal was to demonstrate that you could treat people, and that was a cost-effective way of managing an epidemic, right? So they had no real interest in investing long-term. Their goal from the very beginning was to demonstrate, right? It's going back to spectacle, to demonstrate that this was workable, that it was efficacious, and then hand it off, which is what they did in some ways, right? So they started treating people, they started working on prevention, actually, sorry. So they really focused on prevention efforts, and they wanted to kind of show that you could invest a ton of money in prevention, and that could become a model that the government could then take over. And in some ways, this was both a failure and a success. So the success was that, at the end of it, they said, we've done a great job, we've shown that it works, and they handed it over to the Indian government. The failure was that the evidence that they used to demonstrate the success was very kind of minimal, right? So they would, for example, and I've heard all kinds of stories I've seen, they would send people out who don't have kind of local area knowledge to go to various sites to see uptake of prevention knowledge materials, to look at positivity rates. And, folks who are working at the local level who receive this funding through a series of intermediaries would often give them what they wanted to hear, right? They would give them the data that was desirable. They would doctor things. And I don't say that to be critical of the folks on the ground, because I think they were doing really important work, but they also knew that they had to keep the kind of wheels greased, right? To keep the funding going to support these communities, they knew they had to produce a certain kind of data. And so to kind of shift gears again, while I was doing this work, I became really interested in tuberculosis. And the reason why is that in the clinics where I was working, I would see that patients would be dying of tuberculosis, not of HIV directly. And when I talked to doctors in the hospital, nurses, so on and so forth, they would say to me, well, HIV is manageable, it's chronic, but TB is curable, so it's not really a concern. But then I would say, then why are folks dying? And they would say, well, there's lots of reasons. Maybe the people are not particularly adherent, or maybe something else has happened. There was kind of a inability to grapple with this thing that was happening in the face of this strong discourse of curability, right? So it is a curable condition. Therefore, even though we see with our eyes people are dying from TB, there must be some other reason for it, right? And this is, someone like Paul Farmer would argue that this is entirely about shifting the discourse of blame, right? So you could say, if you're a doctor, you blame the patients and their families for being non-adherent. If you are the doctor, patients themselves, you might blame yourself, or you might blame your doctors for not providing you with the right kind of medication, or it might be because they're too expensive, so on and so forth. But what I really found interesting throughout all of this is that these kinds of explanations seemed quite insufficient, because they all left this idea of cure itself unquestioned, right? It kind of left this question of what it really means to be cured and how you know it to the side. The idea that tuberculosis was curable was kind of sacrosanct. You couldn't really question this. HIV, however, was deeply understood to be manageable, chronic, livable. There was almost, I think of it as a kind of catechism that was delivered to patients, where they, you would sit down with them and say, this is just like diabetes or sugar. And like diabetes, you can take your medication daily and you'll be absolutely fine, even if that's not really the case. There was actually an interesting day shortly after the person who was known as the Berlin patient, the first patient to be cured of HIV or functionally cured. After the story kind of came out in the papers, patients came into the hospital, and one of them asked, they asked the doctor, I've heard now that there's a cure for HIV. Can you give me this cure? And the patient and the doctor said, no, you must have misread or misunderstood. There is no cure, but as soon as one arrives, we'll make sure that we give it to you right away. And when the patient left, the doctor said to me, actually, there is a cure, right? There is this possibility of cure, the specter of cure, in that we have this Berlin patient, we have various infants who have now been shown to be functionally cured, but these kinds of cures can never work in a place like India, right? So this became a very kind of geographically specific argument. It was about, we don't have the resources to do this kind of, to develop these forms of interventions, to produce kind of a sterile environment, because part of the HIV cure involves basically nuking your immune system, right? So you're able to receive the transplant. And they were just like, well, we can't produce those conditions. This is much more of a cure for one, or kind of idiosyncratic cure. It's not a cure that can be scaled up, right? And so this for me was an incredibly interesting moment where TB and HIV switch places a little bit, right? It becomes now HIV is the almost curable condition, but not quite, or it's a cure that's disavowed because it's not a cure that's adequate to the moment or a cure that's scalable. And I think more generally, what we've seen, some things like personalized medicine, is this kind of revamping of how we think about these categories, whether it be curable or manageable or so on and so forth, and what scale they have to work at, right? So if you think about a randomized controlled trial, it requires efficacy at large numbers. And with individualized medicine, we have to rethink how do we prove efficacy when the sample size is 1, right? Or 2, or a very, very small number. So I think we're in a moment where we're seeing a kind of a restructuring of how we produce knowledge around what counts as cure or efficacious therapy.
Yeah, that's super interesting. The gene editing trials that I ended up focusing on were a follow-up on a fermentation experiment, basically using the tools of gene editing, very expensive, to produce these personalized cures. And they as they entered the market, came out with price tags of $400,000 or $2.1 million for subsequent gene therapy. So even in places like the States, utterly unaffordable for most people. But there was a way that geography figured into the doctor's accounting for why this quote unquote cure wasn't available. And maybe as a sideline, there's no guarantee that these gene therapies are cures, right? They're marketed as that, or the companies that are developing them would like to fuel that hope and imaginary, but the clinical data aren't there. But there's a way that geography was coming into the doctor that you were in dialogue with, his explanation of why this wasn't applicable to India. And I think there's also a way that geography is playing out in these earlier ideas about bacteria that you engage with. You say, despite Koch's announcement in 1882 that tuberculosis was engendered by bacteria, that didn't dispel the sense that the causes were primarily environmental go away, whether it's environment and geography and the imaginaries of the Delta variant, or coming together in the Wuhan origin stories, either connected to the wet market or the lab leak hypothesis. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that broadly, geography, environment, and how it's playing out in these racial imaginaries.
Absolutely. There was a part in the middle that I missed because I think either it froze from your end or mine, but I think generally you just want to kind of talk about how geography plays a role in some of these conversations. Okay. I think this is a really interesting through line for the book because geography, what it means to think geographically, mutates quite strongly over the course of, say, the 19th to 20th centuries. If you think about an earlier moment when therapeutics was tied, it's even going further back, think about pilgrims, right? Think about the itineraries of worshipers who would go to specific shrines, whether it be in Hinduism or Islam or Christianity. The idea that specific sites have curative power, right? And it's not something that you can necessarily take with you. Of course, there are moments when you can take, say, sacred ash or water and bring it back to a loved one. But in general, the idea is that one must travel to the cure. The cure can't come to you, right? So there was a kind of imaginary of a therapeutic geography that was built upon one going to a place, right? And then later on with tuberculosis itself, you have this idea that it is the itinerary itself that's curative. So you have this idea that getting on a ship from England and taking that journey across the waters to India is what's going to cure you. It's not India itself, it's actually like the voyage. And then in the early 20th century, you have this strong idea that India is pathogenic, right? That the environment itself lends itself to specific kinds of illness that are somehow distinct. India stands as a kind of epidemiological exception to the rule, right? So even if bacteria in general cause cholera, tuberculosis, so on and so forth, Indian cholera, Indian TB are somehow different, right? So the kinds of methods used in England won't work necessarily in India. And moreover, they won't work for British folks, right? So then you get into an idea of, this idea that certain races belong in certain places, right? So racialized bodies, whether it be a white body or a brown body, depend on their health, depend on certain places in order to maintain a sense of health, right? So in chapter 2 of the book, which is called Cures Elsewhere, I talk about these stories where you have British soldiers, administrators who who are initially sent to hill stations across India. And these are hill stations that are meant to somehow mimic the climate in more temperate zones in Europe. And eventually they're then forced back to England or perhaps to Australia or to Switzerland. Because the idea is ultimately one can't be thoroughly cured in India. You're always going to have a relapse, right? There's no possibility of a permanent, enduring cure. And this is quite interesting because it leads to a whole set of consequences for both soldiers and for the government, the colonial government at the time. Soldiers would often fake their diagnoses because they didn't want to lose a pension, right? They didn't want people to know they had tuberculosis because then they would lose their jobs and lose all of the benefits that go along with it. So they would often, and you see in the archives, you see these documents where doctors who know this are very careful not to diagnose tuberculosis if they can avoid it. They will often try to, find other pulmonary conditions, other fevers to pin to somebody before they pin tuberculosis on them, right? Similarly, you have Indians, folks who are coming from India who are living in England, who are then told they have to go back to India in order to have to be cured, right? So it's not that India is pathogenic in and of itself, but it's pathogenic to specific kinds of racialized bodies, right? So you're the shuttling back and forth of Indian bodies back to India, British bodies back to Britain and Europe more generally, although Britain itself is thought to be somewhat soggy and pathogenic as well. And so Switzerland's better, Germany's better, Britain's okay. It's still better than India, right? And then for me, the most interesting moments though are when you have people moving in contrary directions, right? So there's these great stories about, for example, people like Kamala Nehru, right? She's the wife of the first prime minister of India who ends up going to Germany for her cure. And there's a kind of strong argument between her and Gandhi about whether she should just stay in India or not. And Gandhi says, of course, the Indian sun is great. Why isn't this enough for you? And she says, no, no, no. All my doctors say I must go to Germany. So there's this dialogue about how specific environments work even on an Indian body. But then you also have great stories about, there's one particular story about an Irish school teacher in the early 20th century whose doctor tells her that she must go to a more tropical climate to find her cure. So she ends up going up. She ends up trying to travel to India and begging the colonial government to offer her free passage on a military ship, right? And she says that my sister-in-law and my brother are both living in India, so in order for me to be with them, would you please allow me this passage? And so there you have these strong kinds of claims of kinship to try to ask the state to provide this this kind of therapeutic passage. And there, you have to kind of suspect, is part of this have to do with money and not just about cure, right? Because she's at that point unable to work anymore. She's kind of, she's broke basically, right? And so when you're reading these documents, you have to think to yourself, to what extent is cure about more than, let's say, clinical transformation, but actually about things like your pocketbook? So maybe where you can find cure is where you can survive without having to work.
Elaine, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bharat. I really enjoyed reading your text. So I've been wanting to ask you, you say that the central contention of the book is that our imagination of cure shapes our understanding of time. And you don't just mean that, we need historical frameworks to think about this, but rather that, what do you call it? You say, your phrase is temporality of therapy itself. And I was really curious about that actually, because is there a distinction between therapy and cure in your mind? Because they seem different to me. And this is maybe one of two instances where you use the word therapy. And I wonder what are the implications of using that instead of cure or curative? And if you'd like to just kind of expand a little bit more on what you mean by temporality of therapy. And then I do have another question as well, but I can ask it later if nobody has other questions.
Sure. Maybe I'll start backwards. So we'll talk first about temporality. So one of the things I wanted to think about in this book was how time in multiple forms is shaped by how we imagine cure, right? How we imagine, and I'll talk a bit about what I mean by that. But basically, if you think about maybe a more, and this is a very ungenerous polemic way of saying this, but I'll just go ahead and say it, a kind of more standard way of approaching this would be to say, well, here's a history of all of the different kinds of therapies, right? And we can talk about them in historical context. And so we'll say, here's the sanatorium, and sanatorium is followed up by the antibiotic cure, and then by whatever will come next, right? And each of them have their specific conditions, and there's kind of a linear, a progress narrative potentially, or a narrative of at least a narrative of change. And I think what troubled me about this, specifically as an anthropologist, is that history can all too often come to be a kind of background, especially in anthropological work. I mean, there's this kind of infamous first chapter, which is the historical context chapter, which I always dislike. I mean, I hate to say that. I mean, they're very informative, but they often feel like they're just there so that you know what came before, so that you can enter into the present action. But that kind of history felt to me like it was entirely just background. It didn't really have any kind of activity or potency in and of itself. So I tried to kind of think about how when we imagine cure, we're actually actively producing certain kinds of temporalities, temporal formations, right? And I saw this kind of most intimately in the way in which a specific individual might experience a cure, right? So if we think about one really powerful standard way of imagining cure, it's that it's an ending, right? It's the end of illness, the end of suffering, the end of treatment. In that kind of way of imagining cure, it's temporality that goes, it's clear progress where you start off sick and then you get better, right? And you can even think of it as a circle because you're going back to where you came from, right? So you start off well, then you get sick, then you're better again, and that better again is a return. And this kind of a narrative of return really underpins a lot of how I think, how a lot of people imagine cure, how a lot of governments imagine cure, how a lot of people want to imagine cure, right? As a kind of restoration, right? This also underpins medical anthropology. You see this constantly in the way in which cures are discussed. I mean, even implicitly, this idea that it's a restoration of a sort, right? And then you have this other kind of way of imagining, which is of more kind of transformative way of imagining cure, right? One in which one becomes something entirely different, right? So it's not a restoration, but it's actually a revolution in a way, right? And you see that, I mean, I think about, for example, the work of Frantz Fanon, kind of most crucially, but also disability studies, where you have this idea that to get better, to become something else, is not simply to restore one to where one was before, if there's even a before you can actually refer to, right? This kind of imaginatory before when things were totally fine, but it's actually to become otherwise, or to become otherwise in community or in environment, right? So to enter into a transformed environment. So if I think about going back to Fanon, one of the things he argues is that you can have no real lasting psychiatric cure in the presence of colonialism, right? And he means that both in terms of the French actually being in Algeria, but he also means it's in terms of the kind of colonized mind, the colonized consciousness, right? It requires a real transformation in order to affect what he thinks of as a real cure. No amount of talk therapy or psychopharmaceuticals will achieve this, because the problem lies outside of the mind. It's both inside and outside of the mind, right? The problem is somehow epistemic, but also generalized. It's a condition, right, in which we live. And so in that sense, I think how we imagine cure, and imagine again is a practical activity. It's not simply I'm sitting here imagining, but it's something that I do, right? How I imagine cure shapes a kind of temporality of treatment, right? Of treatment for, and these are always interlocking. So you have these doctors, you have patients, you have their families. How they imagine the cure is going to work is how they imagine their lives will proceed as well, right? So, for example, a patient who said, I used to be a school teacher. So what I imagine is that once I'm cured, I'll go back to teaching, right? Or once I'm cured, I'll be able to get married and have children, or something else entirely, right? Different kinds of, once I'm okay. I mean, so in the early mid 20th centuries, a real focus on what it meant to be cured was to be able to return to labor. So once I'm cured, I will return to the factory. And then at certain points, there's a sense that, no, you'll never return at all, right? There's no possibility of return. So in that case, the sanatorium becomes life. So that is where you will be forever. And so the idea of being cured is one in which your life is entirely different. You're no longer with your family, you're no longer with your community. Now you live here and you live a different kind of life. And this is a kind of more transformative cure, one that of course has its downsides, but regardless, it's not a kind of idea that you will ever return to how things were. And I think a lot, kind of turning to the COVID example, I think a lot about this idea of long COVID, right? This kind of idea that COVID will haunt you even after you've been treated and you're clean per se, right? To kind of use that language. This idea that, for a lot of folks, 5-10 years down the line from now, even if you've come through that treatment process, you're still going to have COVID affecting your body. But not just that, right? It also affects families, families, communities. I think again about India, entire villages, entire families that have been decimated by this, right? And so there's no kind of coming out of this and returning back to how things were. There's a real kind of shift, right? And that's and I think the figure of long COVID pushes us to think about that, think about kind of what happens after, if there is an after, and what that might look like. And sorry, can you remind me of the other question again?
No, I haven't asked it, but I was curious about the use of the term therapy, because it seems to me to speak more of a, biopolitical operation, right? It seems more about duration rather than cure, which is what you're talking about, a restoration to a former, state, or kind of achievement of some kind of a better place, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely.
Therapy seems different to me than cure, but I'm curious how you're thinking about it, because I'm thinking about pathology, and also I'm thinking about pathology in plants, but there, it's crops for people, and so I'm curious about therapy, disciplining of various kinds of bodies, rather than cure or getting like a superior variety or a superior state. It's kind of this endless biopolitical procedure of constant improvement of different varietals. Maybe that's a context for why I'm asking about cure and therapy, how you're thinking about either one. And they might be synonymous for you, right?
No, this is really helpful. And thank you for that context, actually, because it helps me think about this. I think I do use therapy, treatment, cure somewhat interchangeably. And the reason why is because these terms are all used in the context of talking about tuberculosis treatment or HIV or, all these conditions. And part of what's at stake for me, though, is trying to think really carefully about how these terms are being used in these contexts, right? Specifically cure, but how treatment, for example, dovetails with cure, how therapy dovetails with cure, and how that kind of destabilizes what we mean by cure in the first place. So, Matthew Wolfmeyer has a really beautiful essay where he talks about this typology between therapy, remedy, and cure. And he talks about cure as endpoint. I think therapy, as you described, is kind of longue durée, and remedy is maybe like a short-term, like a fix of some sort, right? So I think maybe he talks about prostheses, for example, things that can be taken on and off. And while his essay is quite beautiful and really helpful to think with, what worries me is that it assumes that we already know what these things are to begin with. We already know what a therapy is, we know what a cure is, and when we hear cure, we know that it is this endpoint. And what I've seen over and over again, both archivally and in the present, through my ethnographic work, was that cure never really worked that way, right? It was spoken of this way, but when you see a patient who's been cured 10 years ago coming back again for treatment, it's not quite the same as, say, a long-term therapy where there are long-term therapy where there's kind of no break, but it is kind of an intermittent kind of therapy, right? It's one that goes on for several years potentially each time, and there's patients who were cured 3 or 4 times who I would meet, and so in their case they would get their treatment for 6 months, 8 months, they'd be fine for a year, then they come back again, have it for another year or two, fine again for a few months, then go again, and these kinds of temporalities don't really align with this idea of cure is ending. Even though people are still hoping for this, they still aspire towards this idea that this is going to be the last time, this time I will be cured once and for all. Yet at the same time, the kind of empirically existing way in which cure operated was never quite so clean, right? And so one of the real arguments or emphases of the book is to kind of think carefully about how cure operates in these particular contexts, these particular moments, and not just to kind of fall back on this idea that cure is in fact an ending, as we might so hope, right? Or even if it is an ending, perhaps it's only one of many endings, that we have ending after ending after ending after ending. So perhaps if cure is marked by ending, it's not a singular ending, but actually one that's quite multiple and expansive and ever reaching. And again, I think this is if we think about Rosenberg's kind of classic essay on pandemics and the kind of pandemic structure and its narrative. When does a pandemic end, right? I think for many of us, maybe here in Los Angeles, if I walk around, it feels like it's over. It's it's ended. But I think for myself, because I have half my mind always in India, it doesn't feel that way at all, right? So I feel like I'm often operating as if I'm in Chennai or Delhi rather than being in Los Angeles, because the end hasn't quite arrived, or maybe it arrived already and then we're in something else now, right? We're in some sort of afterlife or after the end. Because there were moments when people said in India that, for whatever reason, whether it be climate or prior exposure to other illnesses, that COVID would not be a serious problem in India, right? So that was a kind of ending that passed away. And I think similarly, we're at a kind of endpoint here in the US, but I have to ask, what kind of an ending is this, right? Is this just the first amongst many? Or is it kind of a true final kind of end, right?
It's, I really like what you're doing there with the uncertainty of the end, and how you never quite know if the cure is going to lead to remission or reinfection or some other unforeseen circumstance. Soraya, go ahead. I think you're muted, Soraya.
Okay, I was making some comments about the end of COVID, which is very unclear. But I actually wanted to ask you a little bit about this imagination, because I am a little bit unclear whose imagination it is, and if there are also a clash of imagination. So for instance, is it the imagination of the researchers? Is it the imagination of the doctors? Is it the imagination of the patient? I imagine you speak more about this when this moves on, but yeah, can you tell us a little bit about these imaginations? And is there just one imagination about this tuberculosis and how it's developed, or what the cure is, or what the cure is, or if it's a cure? Or is there a clash, a multiplicity of imaginations that also may clash?
That's right. Thank you. This is a great question. It's absolutely a multiplicity, but they don't always clash, right? I think this is where Eben said something at the very beginning, which was quite interesting about the kind of the exceptionalism of India, right? And the kind of thinking about bacteriology and its rise. One of the interesting things that happens in places like India, and I think more generally, is that when you have these new imaginations of either disease or of cure or treatment, they often in some ways synchronize, right? You have these particular moments when you can both imagine, say, that tuberculosis is caused by bacteria, but also imagine that the cure might actually lie in environment, right? In environmental interventions or nature cures more broadly. And so I think on one hand, we need to kind of pay attention to this diversity of imaginations. And this is kind of why when I say, we have on one hand, this very kind of hegemonic imagination of cure as endpoint, right? As a kind of final endpoint. This is one that is pushed constantly. If you think about the Susan Komen kind of race for the cure, right? The kind of breast cancer awareness and fundraising kinds of events, as someone like Lachlan Jane has written about quite extensively. These kinds of marathons operate through an imagination of cure as kind of final endpoint, right? Once you hit the cure, the marathons are over, we've gotten there. Similarly, the Indian government pushes all kinds of what you might think of as kind of health propaganda, telling people, don't be worried, don't stigmatize, because this condition, tuberculosis, is curable. And they very much mean, it is curable in the sense of once you've finished your complete treatment, you're done, it's over, right? So there's this kind of strong push towards producing a kind of singular imagination of what cure is, which is cure is ending. Now, what I think I've tried to do in the book is kind of through attending ethnographically and historically to how cure operates and kind of unfurls and how it fails, is to kind of heed these other imaginations that have also emerged, right? So imaginations of patients and their families, of doctors, of lab techs, but also of government administrators, of bacteriologists, sanatorium directors, even at various points, like folks who work with animals, like vets and sanctuary overseers, to kind of think about how animals might achieve something like cure and what that kind of looks like, right? So these imaginations, I think, first of all, they are multiple. I think the problem is we often don't heed these other imaginations, right? So going back to Elaine's earlier question, we tend to think of cure in the singular, not cure as this thing that looks quite different if you really attend to it. And I think that they can both, like, they obviously, of course, they can clash, but they can also synchronize. Another really good example, actually, so in the mid 20th century, when you have India kind of doing its first big kind of randomized controlled trial around antibiotics for tuberculosis, you actively there produce an imagination of cure as ending, right? A cure that's produced through or demonstrated through this kind of specific procedure by these authorized figures who then are able to say, okay, now we have a cure for tuberculosis that isn't ending, and this is a cure that is radically democratic. It doesn't require you to pay a lot of money to go up to the sanatorium, leave your family, and spend months, if not years, there, right? So this is a really kind of novel and radical vision of what cure will be. Now, this has really strong effects around the world. I mean, you have over time the gradual closing of sanatoriums and a kind of turn towards this kind of democratized idea that pills will save us all, right? At the same time, you also have these more, let's call them subterranean ways of imagining cure that are also operating alongside this. So you do have certain sanatorium directors who refuse to close their doors, who keep on going because they basically say, these pills, there's one sanatorium director says, pills can't, the metaphor is a bit strange, but basically pills can't cure an earthquake, right? And so the idea here is that what needs to be fixed is somehow more grounded, quite literally. It's more environmental, more based in nature and relationships between bodies and their environments. And a pill can't really come in there and amend that relationship. Even if you do believe in bacteria, it's not adequate, right? You also have, as I mentioned before, in kind of popular media, things like film, things like novels, you have this idea that, so a few years after this big study that's done in India, you still have films where people are, shuttling themselves off to Switzerland or to Germany to find their cure up in the hills, right? This idea that you still need to kind of get away from here, and that a cure can't really come in a box, it can't come in a vial, it can't come in a pill form, right? And so these things, on one hand, you could say that they clash, they produce a kind of antagonism, and I think that's true if you have powerful enough figures to push those arguments, right? So if you have two figures who have really strident differences on what a cure looks like, and they're able to vocalize that in a public forum, so if you have, for example, bacteriologists versus folks who are more invested in sanitation or more invested in environment, and you see that kind of conversation play out in the pages of, say, the British Medical Journal or the Indian Journal of Tuberculosis, then you have a really strong clash. But more often than not, what I kind of found was that you would have either these ideas of cure that somehow synchronize. So you can say yes antibiotics, but also yes environment, or you have ideas that kind of live separate but simultaneously, right? So you can have both a kind of natural vision of cure and antibiotic vision of cure, and the two don't have to actually synchronize. They can both operate simultaneously, and no one's really pushing them into confrontation, right? Again, BCG is a really interesting moment in India, because when the BCG vaccine comes out, that's where you're really forced to ask questions about, what is a cure, what is a vaccine, what is a therapy, what is efficacious, because that's when you're really kind of pushing that into bodies in a kind of very compulsory way, right? So that's when the kind of, what's the metaphor, when the something hits the road, when the rubber hits the road, when vaccines go into bodies, at that point you can't just live and let live. You have to actually have a forced conversation around what all of this means and how all of this works.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the work of Anne-Marie Moll about the multiple, body multiple. That's also possible, right?
So,
Good. Because, yeah. Evan, are you still
Hey,
there?
Evan, did you freeze up? Oh, he's gonna, all right, he's gonna.
But it's also nearly 4. I don't know what you plan, Archie.
Yeah, let's see if he zooms back in. I was wondering if you might say just a little bit about, oh, sorry, Adriana, I didn't see your, yeah, Adriana.
See about our current moment in time. That's a big question. Yeah. So I'll just maybe I should read it out loud because I'm not sure if it'll show up in the video.
Oh, Evan has come back.
Okay.
In a different form. No, sorry. No, but it's.
Should I go ahead and answer this or talk about this a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, please do. And the question was, what does the discourse on the end of AIDS say about our current moment in time?
Yeah, this is really interesting. You know, I think, well, we've lived through this before, right? There's been the call to the end of HIV, end of AIDS for decades now, right? And I think it's received a kind of new kind of reinvigoration because of these particular instances of people being functionally cured, right, of HIV. But I think, you know, in some ways, we should think about this as a kind of iteration of a particular kind of structure of expectation, right? So this idea that we will reach the end of HIV, the end of tuberculosis, the end of COVID even, right? There's a kind of real incapacity to imagine living with because we always kind of push towards this end. HIV in a way offered a different kind of model because of the fact that it allowed for this idea that one can survive perhaps to a normal lifespan by taking antiretroviral drugs, right? One could have a good life. One could have a quote unquote totally normal life, as I often heard in the clinics. But in a way, this was also determined by the fact that there wasn't a cure available. And I think when this kind of specter of cure reemerges, or even a vaccine, it really pushes us immediately back to this idea that maybe we can kind of come to the end of this. And, you know, I think a really kind of powerful example of why this particular imagination of the end of HIV or of anything really fails is polio. You know, polio vaccination campaigns have been going on for God knows how long. And there's always these, you know, the holdouts, the places where you're not able to get the vaccine to the people who require it, or it's the wrong kind of vaccine, or so on and so forth, or it reemerges. And I think that from a public health perspective, we need to start imagining something like what it might mean to live sustainably with with these forms of illness, and to imagine disease as somehow part of human existence, as opposed to something that needs to be abated entirely or somehow done away with or ended. Now, this is somewhat easy to say. I think, you know, I'm sitting here and talking to you as someone who's not necessarily suffering with these conditions, and so it's easy for me to say, well, let's let them live with it. So I understand that it might come off as a bit harsh, right? For someone who's living with tuberculosis or HIV or COVID, you definitely aspire towards a kind of ending. You want this to be over and done with, right? At the same time, going back to an earlier point, what would it mean to imagine a world in which HIV or tuberculosis isn't done with, but somehow we're able to live with it, and then again reinvest, right? Invest in other kinds of imaginations, other kinds of public goods, right? So imagine if instead of spending the millions upon millions trying to immunize, you know, a tiny percentage of people in particular places from polio, which I agree is important. What if we were to imagine reinvesting, say, in sanitation, in kind of food supply, in education, so on and so forth? How do we kind of radically open up what we mean by an intervention to go beyond this kind of very narrow vertical getting pills in bodies or getting injections into bodies, right? And imagine other kinds of more perhaps radical cures.
Thanks so much. I've actually got a burning question. I usually try to cut it off right at the hour, but if you have time to stick with me for one more question, and in part it's channeling Hannah Landecker to ask about the biology of history of mycobacterium tuberculosis, but also stingers and Plato to think about the pharmacon of the pills. So, you know, we've got a bug and we've got patients both living with what I understand to be very toxic chemical substances. When you're doing tuberculosis therapy, I understand like one of the issues is non-compliance because the drugs are so toxic. So I guess I'm asking about how the bugs are responding. Do we have a resistome? How are the antimicrobial resistance genes getting around in these different populations of bacteria? But also, I guess it's a question about resistance of the patients, resisting a certain mode of compliance, and what does life look like, I guess, with these toxic chemicals from the bacteria's point of view, but also the patient's point of view.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, I think the kind of language of resistance very much is used to describe patients for whom treatments don't work, right? So you have, for example, within tuberculosis, you have this idea of multiple drug resistance, extreme drug resistance, and now what's called totally drug resistant, strains that don't respond to any available treatments that any of the currently available antibiotics. And when it comes to patients, you have a kind of related idiom, which is that of non-compliance, non-adherence, or default patients, defaulters who don't take their medication. And you know, the way in which kind of global public health has responded to this has been through surveillance, right? Through the program that's called DOTS, Directly Observed Treatment Short Course. And the idea is that you would go into a clinical setting where you would be given the pills that you take for that day, and you swallow them in front of somebody who's going to watch you actually swallow them, right? And this was thought to be the way to ensure 100% kind of adherence. And of course, there's lots of problems with this. People can't afford to take off work and go to the clinic several times a week for months to years. People don't want other people to find out, whether in the family or in their communities. And if they're always kind of darting away to go somewhere, you know, it becomes challenging to keep those secret. It's also quite expensive to have to, you know, say travel across the city to go to your specific clinic. So what ends up happening in reality, despite the fact that DOTS is the national program in India and the program that's used globally, is that people work around this, right? So you go to the clinic, you pick up, the person who's there gives you, say, an entire month's supply, right? Or more often, nobody's watching, right? So they give you the daily pills, and then they just like send you off. No one's actually watching you swallow, because the folks who are working these jobs are really uninterested in watching people swallow pills, right? They're just sitting at a desk filling out a form saying, so-and-so came in, got the pills, check, right? They're not really gonna sit there and watch you swallow it, especially at scale. So if you imagine the number of TB patients that might come into a place like this on a daily basis, they don't have the time to sit there and watch you swallow several pills one after the other. And patients will often take hours to swallow these pills because there's so many of them, because they are so toxic, because they can have a series of side effects, you know, from nausea, vomiting, so on and so forth. And so in a way, I think these kinds of ideas of adherence, compliance, only makes sense in light of a really particular disciplinary structure that demands people take treatment in very particular kinds of ways, right? And there's like a long history of studying, you know, can you make this less grueling? Can you give people treatment, say, every other day? Or can you make it into one pill as opposed to several pills? Can you reduce toxicity? But regardless, there's always a kind of, again, a kind of living with this toxicity, of finding a way to endure this in order to come to your ending. And I think this is also why it's so devastating for patients when they're re-diagnosed with TB, because they've put themselves through, you know, several months or years of grueling therapy and dealt with that toxicity, and somehow their cure didn't last despite all of that, right? On the question of the resistance of the bacteria itself, you know, I think, and maybe how it travels, I think is part of what you were asking. This is where we come back to geography, right? This is where, you know, you have, I think we were talking at the very beginning about the kind of Delta mutation of COVID. I mean, similarly, you have this idea that India is becoming a hotspot for tuberculosis and for these really drug-resistant forms. So, a couple of years ago, there was all these stories about Indian patients who were traveling to the US and spreading tuberculosis as they went around. So there's a particular woman who arrived in Chicago airport and then went to go visit family throughout Illinois, Wisconsin, Texas. And it became this kind of public health story because it was about how this one woman had somehow spread multi-drug resistant tuberculosis to all of these various communities, all these various people. But the story is always so strongly racialized. And I think part of it has to do with this itch we have towards origin stories about, who is it that's bringing this particular mutation with them, and how are they racialized? How do they kind of figure as a specter in our kind of imagination of danger of, people from elsewhere bringing tuberculosis back here. And this is also a story about time, of course, because in many ways, if you talk to the students right now about tuberculosis, most of them don't know what it is really. They don't really know what the symptoms are. They don't know whether it's bacteriological or transmitted through viruses. They don't really have a strong sense of it because it is a disease of the past, right? For many of them, it's this idea, it's something that maybe they've heard of, but they don't really have a grasp on. And I think this idea of TB as being a disease of the past is really strong in places like the US, in parts of Europe. And so when someone brings it back, it's this idea that it is the racialized other who is bringing the tuberculosis back into, the white Euro-American kind of place time that has somehow transcended that. It's moved past this, right? So it's a story about both geography, but it's also a story about how people think about time and kind of maybe thinking about someone like Bakhtin, these kind of chronotopes, right? These kinds of places that are both temporal and spatial simultaneously.
So much, and thanks for being so generous with your time. Just a quick plug for next week. We have the Chinese science fiction authors I'm a huge fan. He's the author of Waste Side, and my internet connection. Thanks so much for that.
Thanks.
Yeah, hope to see you back sometime soon.
Thank you, Bharat.
Thanks, Bharat.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.